went on to become a professor at CUNY in New York. That's where I come from. And then at some point, Trend Micro managed to pay me more than the university, which has turned out to be very easy to do. I work for Trend Micro, which is apparently one of the largest security companies in the world. Well, at least that's what our PR says. I'm in the forward-looking threat research team. We kind of are a team that's set up by the CTO to look far into the future, kind of as scouts, and to give the company direction. So I'm not really interested in what's happening now. Sorry guys, with your ransomware, I'm not going to help you. But I will have, will have opinions about things that are coming up. But in any case, let's start from the very beginning. I want to talk about the very beginning, not the very beginning, not with Ada and Babbage, but we're going to start with Phenomenon. Because that was the first sin that was committed. Now, it's true that the architecture that he proposed with a common memory for code and data was a great way of getting the industry started because memory was super expensive. But we now are living with the problem that, well, code and data reside in the same space. Okay, we've worked for 25 years to try to exclude them from each other, but it's not mandatory. And we're still dealing with those problems. And back then it made sense because we were dealing with like mainframes, like these large, like here the IBM 701, where the access control were these guys. And so you didn't really, and programming these machines, was a certain art. So you didn't have to worry that much about security. That changed when we moved to multi-user systems, like this Multics system from the 60s. And Multics is kind of, if you don't know it, does anybody know what Linux is? That? Okay, so Linux was derived from Unix, and Unix was derived from Multics. So this is kind of where everything began. And what's further interesting about it was that this was the first time somebody spent some time, that I was aware of at least, taking a system apart and making a proper threat analysis or a security analysis of it. So a former colleague of mine, Paul Carter, that time he was at the US Air Force. I met him when I was at IBM Research, and it was quite interesting talking to him about how they did these sort of things, because nobody really done this before, as such. Things like that resulted in the 80s with the Orange Book, which is a way of evaluating software. The problem was that the assumptions made were more militarily, governmentally oriented. A lot of things about mandatory security, Bella Padula, if that rings a bell, was a big topic then. There were other models that they could have used, but that was the one that they went for. But this was happening at a time when PCs were starting to come onto the scene. This is already like 1985. Well, the first PC was earlier than that. Apple was even before. So when that time was already coming, was already there with the Orange Book, we already were starting to deal with problems, of the problem of malware. In fact, we've already been dealing with that a lot longer than we thought. The first time that was even mentioned in a formal way was in 1959 already. Even von Neumann himself, he should have. That's what bothers me. He should have known better. Already had been looking into self-replicating automata. But the problem really stemmed more from and I'm not going to say it's necessarily negative, but a lot of the machines that we're dealing with nowadays stem from the time in Silicon Valley when there was like this hacker mentality. Apple was obviously created by people who were very influenced by this DIY market. I know that Wozniak talked a lot to Captain Crunch, otherwise known as John Draper. Oddly enough, I was never able to meet up with Wozniak, but John Draper I know way too well, more than I'd wanted to know. But that mentality of just hacking everything or so was already in there, and that's what led to the Apple I and the Apple II. Now, what was weird was an IBM came along and decided, let's also create a nice big open system or so, and let's put a system like MS-DOS on it. You would have expected them to do something more secure, but nope, they went for the same thing that Apple sort of did. Different processor, but just as insecure. Basically, the Intel processors back then were derived from processors that operated elevators. So that's what basically we were doing. We were using a glorified elevator. At the same time, LANs were starting to become more popular. These are artifacts from an old EA. Anybody know what sort of network this is? Wow, these people are good. And this? Yeah, exactly. So yeah, so that's a very old version of Ethernet. I had to deal with both of them, and I don't look fondly at those times. Um, but malware was coming on the scene because it was also a part of that spirit. I mean, it was like the creeper and reaper, viruses and worms. Those are actually worms. Came onto the scene. They were actually legitimate experiments in resource allocation. I'm pretty sure that anybody who has Trojan horses on their systems doesn't think it's a great resource allocation. But that's what we're living with. Ken Thompson, actually published in his Turing Award speech, so a quine, basically a sort of virus. Ken Thompson also, is one of the authors of Unix and kind of a co-author of the language C. The language C is written specifically for the PDP-11 processor, which is why we have a lot of problems nowadays, because it doesn't fit at all to the 8086 processor. It was basically a layer on top of the PDP-11 processor. But yes, unfortunately, yet another sin that was committed back then. Then there's the Pakistani brain virus. That was kind of like the first one that became more popular. If you want to know more about that, there's a couple of great talks and videos or so from Mikko Hyppönen from, now it's called Security, they keep on changing their name. Great video, look it up on YouTube. Lehigh virus was impactful not because it really spread very far. In fact, it didn't spread outside the university because it led to other things that I'll come to in a moment. And then, of course, 1988, we got Jerusalem, Vienna, and 1701, all these other viruses, so things started to really take off. But at the same time, what was also important was that it was shown by Fred Cohen that malware detection is theoretically impossible. Now, that doesn't stop us from actually doing something about it. There's obviously heuristics you can use. And one heuristic one good one turned out to be based on integrity checking. You can look at how a virus modifies a file and detect only that sort of modification. And that's what IBM AV did for a while. Didn't actually have any false positives except for maybe one. I think it had one false positive, and that was a utility that IBM itself created. So this kind of morphed into what we now use as code signing, which is obviously a better method, so for a lot of reasons. I worked on a more kind of dynamic model for malware detection in 1991. So basically a model which detected the behavior patterns of it in the street. So it created a log file of what it's doing. Out of a sandbox nowadays. Unfortunately, I missed out on coining that term and could not beat me to it. So then we also got organized. So in 1988, me and my professor Blunstein formed the Virus Test Center. The CERT-CC, which was formed at CMU together with DARPA, in response to the Lehigh virus, that's why that's significant, created, and also, of course, the internet worm, created this kind of like the first proper CERT. Then the first organization as an umbrella organization to the CERTs was formed in 1990. When they did that, I thought that was crazy. Why do you need that? But it turned out they were absolutely right. We formed in the antivirus industry. We formed Caro. I formed both Caro and ICAR. There's reasons why they're two different organizations. Won't go to the details. It's too painful. But the important thing about all these things is that these are forms for talking, and this is super important because while I'm a technocrat, I have valued the way that one can exchange things so on ideas and whatever. Well, in the background, another thing was happening, and that was like wide area networking. Whereas like my first contact with the outside world was through actually an acoustic coupler, very clunky thing or so. Larger networks that you can, like I could link to my local point of presence, and then from there I could go other places. Well, there's other things that I'd rather not tell you about. But there's other ways of getting around the world. I could actually get all the way over to the West Coast, machines there not through the internet, but through a different, I think through the Janet was, so that was actually able to do it. And these systems were built for resilience, not necessarily for security. I don't think that's actually a major sin, I would say. It is, after all, important that your backbone is pretty resilient. But they left the security to further up layers, and it took like Netscape really to create SSL as a security layer for HTTP. And now we have TLS, which is standardized in everything. The other thing that happened around the time was automation. There's a lot of early kind of AI in the mix there. The first and only time I've ever heard of single-layer neural networks ever being used was, in fact, for boot sector virus detection. That was kind of neat, but yeah, now everybody does it deep learning. And we used, in IBM, we used hidden Markov models for signature extraction. We also used simulated annealing when it turned out that we had to optimize the patterns. And I expect that most companies are using these technologies nowadays. So while I guess everybody like me is probably frustrated by everybody talking about AI all of a sudden, but it's actually been around for like decades at this point. The other thing that I worked on was digital immune system, which is a very early form of automation of the whole process of you get some malware, you process it, and it spit out the detection for it. And all these things have become pretty much standard at this point, and so it shouldn't be any it shouldn't be any worry or so for most people. If you don't have automation, you're not in the business anymore. So the next part I like to call like the age of resilience, not because we've become resilient, but because we aspire to become resilient. Basically, until that point, there was some hope that maybe one could make our systems secure enough that they just resist these threats. And I think at some point around the 2000s, people realized that's just never going to happen, and now resilience became more of a topic than absolute security. At least that was my perception of it. And this was a time when cyber criminals started to become properly active. Before, most of the viruses were just nuisances. But they also realized that viruses are a liability. As I explained before, we had good heuristics for detecting when a virus was active. It was very easy. You see the replication, and you can detect it. But Trojan horses, you cannot do that. And because of what Fred Cohen had proven, we knew that it was never going to be possible. Now we're stuck with this problem. How do you deal with Trojan horses? So the big thing back then wasn't actually ransomware yet, but you can see that 1989, so well before our current problem was ransomware, we already had that problem. This is the AIDS Trojan disk that was distributed in a conference, just like this. People would load it onto the computer. It would encrypt all of their files, and that's what it would display. A very early form of extortion. But there also were other things in 1999. The CDC, the Cult of Dead Cow, not the CDC, the health organization, published their Back Orifice 2000. I was actually there at DEF CON for that. I didn't quite realize the significance of it, but it was more of a show than anything useful, I thought. But in any case, that kind of laid the path for rats that we also have to deal with. So there's, and generally, this was a time when vulnerabilities and the importance of them were rising. This is also where the Zero-Day Initiative that belonged at that time to HP, Hewlett Packard, started their bug bounty program. And they're now owned by Trend and still active to this day, and they spend millions on bug bounties every year. It's pretty impressive. Early ransomware was very basic. You'd have maybe like this fake police report telling you to, send some money over. But can you spot the problem with this? Ucash? Well, they were having problems cashing out or getting their reward
the tactics, techniques, so that the people use. And the organizations themselves stopped being like monolithic, vertically integrated systems or organizations, and started to kind of divvy up some of the work. So you have an operator that buys their services from other people and deploys it, and then they started to have an affiliate program. So the operator would set up the basics, and then the affiliates would actually execute on it. Now it's actually gone one step further. You have the affiliates really pulling back control, and they're using multiple operators. So that really confuses things when it comes to campaign tracking, because you often have one threat actor using multiple different frameworks, because they're also using different operators, and the operators are using different vendors. So it's making things a bit harder for us, which is probably their intent. The other thing that happened around the time was overlay networks in the 2000s. So onion routing using Tor is probably well known. A lot of underground forums are hidden behind that, even to this day, even though they've also moved to Telegram and other platforms. Then there's also distributed content systems like BitTorrent. Anybody heard of BitTorrent? It's a little bit obscure. Who all uses it? No. There's also IPFS, which is a more recent thing. It basically has the same principle behind it. It's an overlay network. In the case of IPFS, because it's a content system, they break up the document into smaller chunks. It's distributed over the network, and when you ask for something, it pulls in all the various chunks that it needs. The problem with IPFS, and I guess BitTorrent has the same problem, is that it's relatively slow. And so to respond to that, they have something called gateways. And then these gateways will serve the IPFS content through a normal web browser, which is great if you're phishing, because that means that you can use a Cloudflare address. And it's very hard to get Cloudflare to stop hosting some content. And it's even harder to get it out of the IPFS network. Because it's distributed around the place. There's no one point of contact. So even though IPFS itself didn't gain a lot of action in general application, it was great for some phishing actors. It's still not like a major player, but it is certainly something we've been observing. And blockchain generally has similar. Some blockchains have similar capabilities, like Ethereum and ICP have various ways of hosting applications and content, and also serving it again through a gateway server if needed. Bitcoin less, it's really just more for payment. It's the problem with all these things so far is that while they have very limited legitimate uses so far, I mean, maybe that'll change. They do seem to be benefiting the bad actors a lot more. This is one of these things where yes, I love IPFS as an idea. I hate it though, because it's just making our lives so much harder. And it's one of the problems we keep encountering. You guys have probably also heard of cloud computing. It's basically using somebody else's server. Cloud computing has the problem that a lot of people just don't know how to configure it right. It's great that you have infrastructure as services, but it would be great if infrastructure as code. It would be greater if there would be security as code. And I've had arguments with my friends in AWS before that they really need to think about how to integrate security better into their tooling. Here we found like so many servers like this where the whole directory structure was open in S3 as an S3 bucket. And in fact, somebody made it discovered before us because they had put a notice and saying, hey, we could write to your bucket. There's something wrong with your configuration. So cybersecurity becomes very political in recent memory. I guess everybody here remembers Stuxnet. Stuxnet they brought it home, two things home. First, we have political actors, state actors that we have to work with, or we actually deal with, sorry, not work with, deal with. And the other problem was, OT security. That was a blind spot. So that really made OT, so operational technology security, suddenly became a thing and has been probably for the last 10 years at this point. All right, but you're here for the future, future of everything. So I'm going to talk about quantum computing. And the problem that we have with quantum computing is that everybody hears the word quantum and their mind kind of goes into some weird mode, maybe into superposition of reality and irreality. I'm not sure. It's we. It was shown that if we had a universal quantum computer, Shor showed in 1994 that we can do general purpose computation on it, and also showed that we could break our public key crypto with it. And that's been freaking out people ever since. So just very brief, you won't understand it from just these slides, but think of superposition as like a spinning coin, where while it's spinning, you can't really say whether it's heads or tails. It's not even a question you'd ask. And we express it that way as like as a probability or so of it being qubit 0 or qubit 1, and there's a certain probability of each. We also have entanglement, and entanglement is how two qubits get correlated with each other. Through its physical process, you can correlate to qubits, and I like to think of it as twins. So it's not like they're talking to each other. It's just that they kind of, if you know something about one twin, you know something about the other twin. That's how I like to think about entanglement. Otherwise, just read the mathematics, it's a lot clearer. And these get put together into a quantum circuit, which we can, and this is basically what a program would look like on a quantum computer, and in principle, it's a lot faster than in a normal computer for some restricted problems. So, but it's always going to be a coprocessor, unfortunately. Now, obviously, it has the potential to break our public key because Shor's algorithm very specifically is able to factor large integers very quickly using a quantum Fourier transformation. And I could spend another half an hour going into the math. If you want to hear about it, we can ask whether we can cut out somebody else's talk, but I think you guys will be enough. Now, this is not a problem for AES. AES gets a little bit of a speed up through another algorithm called Grover's, but not enough to make any difference. And there is now post-quantum cryptography, so if you're feeling paranoid, you can use that. But what to expect is that we're not really going to see like universal quantum computers very soon. I'm thinking at the moment 10 to 20 years, despite all of the hype, all the stock market stuff and everything. Ignore all of that. Ignore the word quantum. Use your critical thinking and just consider, even if they had a prototype that worked now with like 1 million qubits, so that's the minimum that we need to do something useful. They still would have to build it in quantity, and that still would take years and years. So we got time. Don't worry about that. What we might see though are very specialized quantum computers that are not quantum supreme, but have a quantum advantage, i.e., if you have like a very large data center with GPUs, then that might cost you a small fortune to run in energy. The quantum computer might be able to do the same thing with a lot less energy, and that might still be worth it for some applications. And we'll have to see how that develops. So you have to just consider what your risk model is. If you need your data to be private for the next 10 to 20 years, maybe you want to start doing post-quantum cryptography like right now. Otherwise, sit back, relax, drink some coffee or tea. It'll be funny. What's maybe more interesting is the quantum internet. That it's based on two algorithms, BB88 and BB92, which has nothing to do with the BB droid from Star Wars. It's provably secure, although it has some other issues. The problem is that it's super cumbersome to set up a quantum key distribution system in reality. People offer the technology to Shiba and some other companies do it, but it's still super expensive, requires extra lines and high-grade fiber optics. It's not practical yet. What's more useful, but not really related to what we do yet, at least, is quantum sensors and measurement. You could actually replace GPS with a quantum-based system. In fact, the British Navy, I think, is actually experimenting with that at the moment. So we'll see whether that becomes a thing. Unfortunately, it's not like my GPS watch. It's more like a washing machine size box or so. There's going to be new hardware coming on the line that you might want to be aware of. risk 5 has a lot of geopolitical things attached to it, or so. Countries like China would like to get better access to computers, and if risk 5 becomes a thing, then I'm pretty sure that China would really appreciate it, and that's something we might have to worry about, because then we don't really quite understand the supply chain problems when it comes to the processors. Artificial intelligence is obviously a big topic at the moment. I see LLMs mainly, though, as a way of computation with or computing with text. They're not going to live up to their hype. I personally think that for what we need to do in security, we're going to need a neurosymbolic approach, and nobody has figured out how to do that yet. But it's still exciting. It still has its usage. We have it. We have now various components like that in the process. But do remember, though, that our adversaries are not computers. Our adversaries are humans. And if we start relying on a system that only knows what was available to it yesterday, we're not going to be able to deal with the problems that are coming tomorrow. And so it's important that we stay sharp and don't trust these systems too far. Where we do have to also watch out for is agentic AI, which is coming down the line now pretty fast. The problem there is that we have no idea how these things are actually working internally. It's like black boxes, and they keep on changing. They have all these interesting software supply chain problems, and so they're a nightmare, and they're gonna go out there and start replacing real applications, and I have no idea how we're going to do threat analysis of those things. So we'll find out. Space might be the next frontier. I'm going to skip over this for time reasons. But in the end, kind of do not forget that we're still dealing with humans and everything. Now, we are at a conference together. Talk to each other, because this is where we establish the trust relationships. This is where we we can exchange ideas. But also remember that we're dealing with humans on the other side as well. And they want to attack us, and we have to be just as adaptable as our adversaries are. So with that, I have a very long slide of conclusions, and that is this: just don't be stupid, please. And that's the end of it.